Welcome to today's webinar, ESSA, Assessment Flexibility and Stakeholder Engagement, brought to you by NCSL, National Association of State Boards of Education, and the Hunt Institute. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Lucille Davey. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this third webinar in a series focused on ESSA and stakeholder engagement that is co-sponsored by NCSL, NASB, and the Hunt Institute. As she said, I'm Lucille Davey. I'm a senior advisor with the Hunt Institute, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's webinar. Our focus today is the flexibility around assessment choices that is now available under ESSA and the ways in which stakeholders can be involved in that decision-making. The new law has given states considerable latitude in choosing assessments, including the opportunity to participate in an innovative assessment pilot project that might include competency-based or performance-based assessments, among many other things. The law also requires the engagement of a wide variety of stakeholders in the consultation and decision-making process. This afternoon, we have two speakers from Education First who are experts on issues related to assessment and stakeholder engagement, as well as Representative John Benning, who chairs the Indiana House Education Committee. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Your phones are all muted because of the large number of people participating this afternoon. As a result, we'll take all questions through the chat box, so please enter your questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and what we're going to try to do is answer them either during the presentation or at the end of the presentations, depending on the best fit for those questions and answers. Our first two speakers are from Education First, a national policy consulting group with deep expertise on a broad range of education topics and issues. Bill Porter is a partner at Education First and has served as an education advisor to CEOs, governors, grant makers, and community leaders. He has led numerous projects with partners across the country, including the High Quality Assessment Project that involves 13 states. Heidi Guarino has extensive background in state education agency leadership, policy development, engagement, and communications. She previously served as Chief of Staff and Communications Director for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So at this point, I will turn the presentation over to Bill and Heidi.
Thanks, Lucille, and hello, everyone. This is Bill Porter. I'm going to be, I think, tag-teaming the first part of this conversation with all of you with my colleague Heidi. I'm going to focus, first of all, on elevating and taking some questions and helping us all get on the same page about some of the new flexibilities around assessment choices and testing choices that the federal law ESSA provides. And then Heidi, who has actually done a great deal of work working with stakeholder engagement, is going to zero in a little bit more on some best practices around how you might think about engaging your stakeholders, your parents, your teachers, your school district leaders, other fellow policymakers around some of these decisions and some of these choices and flexibilities that you have around assessment. As Lucille indicated, Education First has been doing a lot of work over the years with states and state agencies in particular around planning and policy research. We've been working pretty intently with a number of states over the last couple of months as they've started diving in and thinking about their ESSA plans that they'll be submitting to the U.S. Department of Education next year. Heidi has done extensive work with several states around stakeholder engagement and has also kind of co-authored with the Council of Chief State School Officers a guide that came out earlier this summer that really includes best practices around stakeholder engagement. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about the content, and then I think Heidi's going to review some of the lessons from the guide that she co-wrote with the council, and together we'll kind of think about with you ways that we can apply that to some of these choices. And then I think Representative Benning is going to wrap things up with giving you kind of his own real-world, having just walked down this pathway in Indiana of really trying to sort out a bunch of really challenging assessment choices and maybe some lessons learned and advice to all of you. As we go along here, I'm going to, I probably talk a little bit too fast, but I'm going to try to slow down at least slide by slide here and invite you to post some questions in the chat. So rather than have you hold your questions, I think it will make more sense if we sort of take questions as they come up. I'll try to be a little bit mindful about how we're doing time-wise here so we keep moving along, but again, would really invite you to pose questions along the way. first thing I want to start with, while this webinar is really about the flexibility and choices that all of you as state leaders have and that the new federal law gives to you, I guess what I really want to start off with, though, is a reminder about like what hasn't changed. And really for the past 20 years or so, there's been some pretty consistent themes in the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, right? So at least for the last 20 years, states have been asked to have clear standards specifying what students ought to know and be able to do. ESSA actually puts a finer point on that by specifying that the standards really need to be pointed towards preparing kids for success in college and careers after high school. ESSA has also long had a requirement that we know how well kids are doing as they progress through the schooling system. And so the provision that's been in place, I think maybe for 15 years, that all students are tested every year, grades 3 through 8, and again in high school remains in place, as well as the requirement that everyone take that test, and that states really need to work to make sure that their school districts are having 95% of kids at least participate, to make sure that kids aren't being excluded, and so that we have a really accurate picture of how well kids are doing every year. Accountability has also been a big part of ESSA, and the new version of the law maintains that. You all will still need to take a look at the data you're getting about how schools are doing and make some choices about how to deliver more targeted and focused supports to schools that are really struggling and to schools that have student populations that are really struggling. With ESSA, you'll be working a lot more in partnership with school districts on that work too. And then finally, of course, the new law, just like ESSA has long done, really gives you some resources that are devoted to supporting Title I students who are students who are usually struggling the most in schools. So, with that reminder about like what hasn't changed, I guess I just want to pivot here and say, I think the challenge that we'll be talking through on today's call then is how to kind of navigate forward. So there's sort of a foundation of stuff that hasn't changed, a floor of expectations and requirements the new law does have. And then on top of that, you'll all have some opportunity to make some choices and possibly pursue flexibility if it's something that your state is excited about, if it's something that aligns well with your state vision. I think the challenge moving forward here is going to be kind of marrying what you want to do, and I think we'd encourage every state to be pretty clear about what is its vision for how you're hoping to improve your school system, what's the endpoint you're trying to manage to, and then match that up with the resources, direction, and flexibility that ESSA provides you. We're going to be talking about this call, as you know, some of the choices then that ESSA gives you around assessment and state testing plans. I just wanted to put this great graphic up. NCSL brought together legislative education committee chairs a couple of weeks ago. It had a conversation actually about one of those choices that you have, which we'll be talking about in today's phone call, and that's more flexibility about what you choose to do for your high school assessment. And this graphic kind of emerged out of the conversation. An artist was present trying to kind of track some of the major ideas. And without diving into the content here, which is maybe a little bit small, the point is that it's not like there's a straight line between here's the flexibility you have and here's clearly what your state's going to do. It's actually probably a pretty twisted and curvy pathway that you're going to need to navigate. As one expert I think said recently, it's not like there's some perfect assessment out there that we just don't know about, or there's some perfect assessment that has just been like in the desk drawer and just people haven't gotten around to using yet. I think a lot of the flexibilities do allow you to experiment and try things new, but with the understanding that you're going to be kind of charting your own path in some ways, and there's not a lot of, in many cases, resources that exist right now to support you in terms of maybe the sort of assessment you want to do. And there's going to be trade-offs. There's for all the things you might want to know from tests about how your kids are doing, how your schools are doing, how teachers are doing, how different targeted resources are working out, how well kids are prepared for success in college. Those are all different questions, and there's probably no one perfect test that's going to help you answer all of those. And so part of your challenge here is also going to be kind of prioritizing what's most important. But let's transition here. Let me get into what I see as I think the 6 big opportunities for some of the innovations, some of the flexibility you could choose to pursue as a state under the new federal law. And again, I'm going to go through each of these individually. I've actually got a slide for each one. I'll try to provide some high-level observations. There's clearly some content on the slides, too, that you will see. But again, I'm going to kind of slow down and would invite folks to chime in with any questions as we go through each one of these. you can see the 6 opportunities I'm going to be talking about now. I want to start by just reiterating that ESSA really challenges states to kind of set out their own vision for what they want to accomplish, and setting out that vision is really important because it ought to drive then the sorts of choices you make about assessment. Number 2, as some of you have probably heard, the law allows a handful of states to propose a different way of doing assessment that relies, as Lucille was saying at the beginning of the phone call, perhaps on more performance assessments or more of a competency-based approach. And so I can kind of talk through a little bit about what we anticipate that might look like, and we can talk a little bit more about which states might find that sort of approach most appealing. Number 3, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resources and the encouragement in the law to have states really take a tougher look at their whole battery of assessments that they offer, as well as the battery of assessments that school districts offer. I think there's been a lot of evidence that collectively between states and school districts, there's too much testing in many places, and that actually a lot of the testing that's done is pretty crappy testing. And so there are resources and kind of a framework in the law to help you dive in and maybe better weed out that thicket of testing in your state. Number 4, I'm going to talk about the flexibility that the law gives you to think differently about high school assessment and to go after a nationally recognized assessment rather than maybe a state-developed assessment, if that makes good sense. 5th opportunity I want to talk about is this kind of intriguing idea that the law lays out there that states could sort of take interim assessments, which are typically offered periodically throughout a school year to help teachers understand where kids are on a path to proficiency or learning the material, but to try to take a kind of a sequence of interim assessments and say, let's bound those up in some ways, and instead of then doing a summative traditional state test at the end, we'd somehow use the scores from those interim assessments to create a summative test score. So talk a little bit about that. And then the 6th opportunity I just wanted to flag was this idea that states are also able to create some flexibility at the 8th grade around the particular math test that kids take. So the kids that are in a more advanced track aren't necessarily taking the more conventional 8th grade test, but could take a test that's more aligned with the content that they've been learning in their advanced classes. There are some strings attached with that, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Before I move forward, I'm not seeing any questions. Just, again, wanted to invite folks to suggest questions. And Lucille and Michelle, I'm definitely not seeing questions. Is that right? I just want to make sure my screen isn't like freezing up on the chat side.
Yes, we're good to go.
All right, we're good to go. All right. So flipping forward, the first thing I just wanted to flag, and this is more of an implicit opportunity in the law, but this idea that to really start sorting out what you want to do with assessment, I think you need to get kind of clear about what is the goal of your system anyways. What are you really after? What are you hoping happens by the time kids leave your system in high school? Is your state's goal really to get all kids prepared for some sort of post-secondary, whether that's a 1-year certificate or a 2-year degree or even a 4-year college experience? Is your state's aspiration to prepare all kids to be college and career ready? Is your state's aspiration really to go about closing achievement gaps? Because that's really what the issue is in your state. So how you answer those questions and how you think about what your overall goal is will cause you probably to have different choices about what sort of assessment mix or what sort of a plan or whether any of these options do or do not make sense for you as a state. As you probably also all heard, the law actually requires states to choose at least one other indicator that's not focused on testing. And so even if you think about what that other indicator are and how you weight the different indicators between how kids are doing every year in terms of achievement on state tests and how kids are growing every year in terms of their achievement, and how your English language learners are doing, to kind of think about how you want to balance all those together and what's kind of the comprehensive picture you need to understand and your school leaders need to understand to know if you're on track for that goal you're setting for the state. So again, I wanted to start with this. This isn't exactly laid out crisply in the law with a particular section to cite, but I think it's a really important both opportunity and challenge for states. I mean, to really begin to lean into these assessment conversations, it's important to start with some clarity about what you're trying to get at anyways, because assessments are all about information. They're all about signaling what's important. They're all about kind of reinforcing the expectations. And in a system of tests and some other measures to really think about what is it you're trying to signal, what is it you're trying to know, what is the data you need for the goals you're trying to reach in your state are going to be really important. So let me pause here for a second. Maybe that's self-explanatory. All right. Let's go to this innovation pilot. As several folks on the phone probably are aware, New Hampshire, as part of its waiver under ESSA, under No Child Left Behind, actually has put in place a pretty innovative system it calls PACE. That's actually was the product of a whole lot of conversations within the state for the last couple of years, and it's been working with a cohort of school districts to really experiment with whether there could be a new way of doing a state assessment and accountability system that relies a lot more on local testing and locally developed and administered, and actually I should say teacher developed and administered and scored performance assessments at the local level for some grades, and a more traditional state assessment in New Hampshire it's Smarter Balanced in other grades. There's been a lot of work leading up to PACE, and I think PACE is now like 3 years in. But kind of based on the early experience in New Hampshire and some other states, I think kind of looking at New Hampshire and saying, gee, that's something we might want to be interested in. ESSA actually invites up to 7 states to win a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education to pursue what are called these innovative assessment systems. The idea is that these assessment systems would try to really push the envelope around maybe more performance-based assessments or more competency-based education. I think it's important to remember that the law doesn't really set up this pilot as we just hate testing in our state, or we have lots of people complaining about too much testing, and so let's do a pilot that's about a lot less testing. That isn't the goal of the pilot, and that's not the way it's set up. In fact, if anything, it's probably going to ask your educators to work a lot harder. It's going to require your state to invest a lot more in the capacity of your kind of local teachers and school districts to really step up to the challenge of kind of owning the decisions around how exactly we're going to test kids, where are these performance assessments going to come from, how are we going to score them, and how are we going to make sure that what we're doing in some years really matches up with what we're finding on the state assessment in other years. I think in New Hampshire there's actually been double testing because they've had to have kids take both these locally driven performance assessments and the state test some years just to make sure that there's some comparability. So that's going to be really important as well. The regulations kind of guiding what this application process looks like are not out yet. What I've heard the department say is that they are going to have a high bar for how they choose these states. I think they really feel like, although innovation is about experimentation and possibly failure, I think they feel like in many states this is going to be the pathway to a new accountability system, and so I think they really want to put in a high bar to say states you really need to lean in and think carefully about what this assessment pilot is going to look like before we approve it. So again, 7 states or groups of states can come together and propose this pilot. The idea is that you would start with kind of a cohort of school districts, and then as part of the pilot you would kind of be able to tell the department your plan for evaluating, adjusting, and kind of growing the pilot statewide. It's going to be important that the pilot can't just be for a bunch of high-performing suburban school districts. The idea is that that whatever this new approach looks like is something that ultimately could be adopted and successful in all school districts in your state. And I know that that's something New Hampshire has tried to be very mindful of. I think it has started with more high-performing districts as the core of its PACE effort, but has deliberately reached out to Manchester, which is its lowest-performing school district in the state, and is really working diligently to kind of bring Manchester in and show that an urban school district with huge achievement gaps can still do well under this kind of new assessment and accountability regime. So I'm not sure if everybody else can. Go ahead.
Yeah. Before you move on, just a couple of questions. The timeline for states that might be thinking about this. I know you said that you can innovate without the pilot or start slowly. What is the timeline, and also how long do you think it would take for a state that isn't doing anything yet, on somebody other than New Hampshire, to actually do this?
I think those are great questions, Lucille. I don't know the exact timeline. I mean, I think the department still has to put out the regulations on this. They haven't even drafted them yet, so I honestly don't know how that's going to resolve itself given the change in administration here in the next couple of months. So I think my guess is that's something that's going to just pay attention to in the next couple of months. In terms of how much time it's going to take, I think it will be. I will honestly say I think it will be harder from a state to start from a blank slate and say, gee, we kind of like this idea of a pilot. Gee, we kind of like what New Hampshire's been doing, and we'd like to build something comparable in our state. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying you ought not to do it. I'm not saying it's not maybe the right thing to try to do, but I think it's going to require a lot more concerted state leadership and effort to make it work. I know, as I said, PACE itself was the process of several years of kind of development and iteration before the U.S. Department of Education gave it the green light. Because again, it requires the state to really think deliberately about, if you're not going to do as much state testing and you're going to instead rely on local educators to do a lot more of the judgments about how kids are doing, there are some real important questions about comparability and making sure that there's kind of a common standard that everybody understands, that you're kind of scoring or aiming for the same standard, whether it's the state test or the locally developed tests. And then I think this question of kind of locally developed tests, where are these tests going to come from anyways? It's not like there's a kind of a secret bank of performance tests just lying around for school districts to tap. I mean, there are some terrific resources out there, but it's going to require states to really think about, how are we going to develop these assessments? How are we going to help teachers understand what these assessments are? How are we going to help teachers apply these assessments? How are we going to help teachers score these assessments? How are we going to help teachers kind of sync up on the common expectations that they need to be reinforcing through these assessments? All terrific questions to be asking, I think, but not questions for the faint of heart. I did want to flag here, and you kind of hinted at this, Lucille, in my second bullet, and maybe I can make this available because I don't think the hyperlink is working here, but the Council of Chief State School Officers actually has a terrific tool designed for SEAs, but frankly I think it's really applicable for any state leaders. It's kind of a decision tree to say, should you pursue the pilot or not? And it really says, what are you trying to do in your state? And if you're kind of more interested in this, then think about this issue, and then maybe it's yes or no on the pilot. Or if you're more interested in this, maybe you don't even have to pursue the pilot. Maybe there are other flexibilities or options within ESSA that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes that might make more sense for your state. And so maybe that's the important thing to close on here. I think this pilot is a high bar on purpose, so that's something that necessarily shouldn't scare you away, but it's something I think to go in eyes wide open, that it really is an experiment, that you will kind of be experimenting for a couple of years in your states in terms of your kids and your teachers' experience. It will probably be more work before it's less work, and that there might be some other flexibilities in the law depending on what your vision is, what you're trying to get accomplished, what you want to use assessments for in your state, that might allow you to do some of the same things without actually applying for the pilot. Mike is asking a question here about piloting innovative systems in English language arts and math. Well, I would say, Mike, given that the focus of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act has always been on sort of reading and mathematics or English language arts and math. I mean, that's really where the pilot flexibility exists. I mean, certainly a state could always, under kind of its own state authority, sort of say, we're actually going to do this in civics education, or we're going to do this maybe in science education for the years that we don't have, the required federal assessment. I mean, that could be really interesting to think about, or it could be a melding. I mean, I think just kind of stepping up in math and English language arts is going to be a big step up. You could think about maybe you want to try to do that in 3 or 4 subject areas, or again, maybe you tackle, and you wouldn't need ESSA to allow you to do this. You tackle a completely different subject area and say, let's start with that and kind of build an alternative assessment and accountability system that's not something that's under the federal microscope of ESSA, but it's kind of our own ability to kind of do what we want, and maybe over time we try to meld those together. I'm going to move on here just in the interest of time. So the third thing I wanted to flag was the opportunity. It's supposed to be $1.5 million per state available for you to conduct an audit of state and locally required assessments. With again, the idea here being that there probably are too many tests collectively administered at the local, the district, and the state level in lots of places, and that collectively the quality of those tests is all over the place, from probably a lot of worksheet fill in the bubble tests to much more sophisticated performance tasks. And so this small pot of money is really designed to give states a little bit of resources and a little added oomph to say, let's lean in and see if we can better understand what testing is actually happening where, what's being tested and why, and whether there are some tests that are redundant or of lower quality that we could get rid of. As I note on this slide, 1.5 million, will go far in some states. It's not going to go quite as far in, Texas or California and New York. And frankly, in any state, you're going to want to be kind of strategic about how you use that money. How much of that do you want to be focused on sort of statewide activities or state-focused assessment, and how much of it do you want to sort of give to school districts, and which school districts to kind of focus on assessments that they're directly responsible for. I will just say, we've done some work with school districts looking at their ticket of assessments, and I think it's really important to find a way of engaging teachers and parents in the process of reviewing. And I think based on our experience, there really is some redundancy out there. I think there are schools and districts that are collectively making choices about what they want to pay attention to and end up making a lot of overlapping assessment decisions. And then you kind of fold it in like, well, what's the data we also get from the state? And then you have even more overlapping. And so I think this is a really productive conversation to have in a lot of school districts, engaging stakeholders in a real serious review about, do we need all these tests? And if we don't need all of them, are there some that are actually higher quality that are really kind of measuring the problem solving and critical thinking and writing skills that we think are more important? I think right now there's been a lot of noise from the department about, I think sort of announcing that this money is available, but the resources have not been pushed out to states yet. So that's, I think, something just to kind of, keep in your back pocket, know that it's coming. It'll be something you'll have the opportunity to probably to kind of put in place and start working on in the next couple of months. The fourth thing I want to talk about here is the flexibility in the law for sort of two related options. Right now, as I said, ESSA requires states to measure English language arts and math in grades 3 through 8, and then again at high school, just like its sort of predecessor, No Child Left Behind did. However, ESSA expressly says that states have the flexibility, have a little bit more flexibility with what they want to do at the high school level, that they could continue to use what you might consider a state-developed assessment, or they could consider what we call a nationally recognized assessment. I think most folks feel like nationally recognized would mean ACT or SAT, for example, or PARC or Smart or Balanced. It would not include AP because not all kids take the advanced placement course. So it really needs to be an assessment that's kind of designed for all kids taking kind of the main curriculum. But the two options here are, as a state, you could choose to sort of choose one of those options as your state test, or you have the option, and this gets to be a little bit messy thinking how this is going to work, but you could actually say to your school districts, you can do the ACT, the SAT, or you can do the state test in high school, you choose. I think that gets a little bit complicated in how you think about comparability between school districts, because at the end of the day, these tests are actually measuring different things, and this gets back to my point earlier about starting with your vision and what you're trying to accomplish. ACT and SAT are clearly focused on sort of aptitude for college. They're really designed as part of a college admissions decision process. They're meant to be sort of, predictive in an admissions context for how well kids are going to do at college. Traditionally, state tests have been more focused on just kind of proficiency. Have you learned the material that we wanted you to learn in high school? And, what PARC and Smart or Balanced have tried to do is to thread that needle and to say, let's both measure what the standards say kids should be learning in high school, and let's work with higher ed to say that if kids do well enough on the test, it's actually some sort of a guarantee that they've learned the skills and knowledge they're going to need to navigate first-year courses. In addition to kind of just thinking through how these tests frankly measure different things, and kind of thinking through which of those things is more important for you as policymakers, what sort of data do your teachers want back? Are they more interested in ACT scores? Are they more interested in data that's more specific to the state standards? What would parents value more? I think it's really important also to think about issues of accessibility here. Most states, for their own state tests, and actually as part of participating in the PARC and Smart or Balanced consortia, have sort of set their own accessibility policies. Like, this is an accommodation policies. Like, here are all the accommodations that we would potentially allow for students with disabilities or English language learners. ACT and SAT have their own accommodation policies, which may or may not be, in fact, in most cases, are not as generous or as comprehensive as the state approach. And so you start thinking about, well, how are we going to navigate that if we've got kids who sort of have certain accommodations that we've basically been taking into account in our state assessment system, and ACT or SAT don't allow those. Or conversely, we ask ACT and SAT to allow those, and then I think the worry is, well, ACT and SAT may then say, well, if we allow those accommodations, then we can't actually tell you that the score the child's gotten on the test actually means anything because you're doing accommodations that we haven't planned for. So again, this is resolvable, but I think this is just a sticky issue to think through. How are the accommodations going to work for kids who have disabilities or English language learners? And I think another wrinkle in all this also is that there is a lot of, frankly, test prep material available for ACT and SAT, and a lot of upper income families kind of have access to tutors and workshops that help them actually increase their ACT and SAT scores. And given that the prevalence of that material out there and the fact that it's something that upper income families usually are better able to access than lower income families, how do you think about kind of just navigating that challenge in your state? Let me go to the next slide here. I'm going to try to get through these last two here, then maybe we can take a few questions before pivoting to Heidi. This fifth bucket I wanted to talk about is this kind of intriguing idea that you could take the interim test that your school districts are administering and knit those together for a summative score instead of administering a separate state test. I will just say candidly here, I think most assessment experts will say this is going to be a little bit challenging to do, which is not to say you can't do it. It's just it's going to be challenging. One of the challenges that you're going to have to figure out is like, what are these interim assessments anyway? In some states, districts are kind of designing one interim assessment, or they're choosing off-the-shelf products. Different districts have different tests they're using as interims, and so this huge issue of comparability kind of comes up again. You know, what if one district is using a lot of performance-driven or kind of teacher-developed assessments for its interims, and what if another school district is using an off-the-shelf product which may or may not be aligned to your state standards? Like, how do you smooth all that out? The other real wrinkle with this, of course, is that a summative test is really meant to look back over the whole school year, and so that's why they're given so late in the school year, which also means why the test scores come back so late. You know, with the interim data, you would need to assure that kids have more or less covered the same content at each one of those checkpoints, and so it kind of pushes states more towards like a pretty, you know, single scope and sequence curriculum, right? Like you can't have kids in one district learning certain math concepts first quarter and in a different school district learning those same math concepts in a different quarter, because if everyone's taking the interim assessment, you kind of need to know that, hey, this is what we're testing on so that we can use that data to roll for the summative score ultimately at the end of the year. So again, I thought these not to say this isn't something you shouldn't do. I'm just saying you need to go into this eyes wide open and recognize that there's some technical issues and just some political issues you're going to want to sort through. The sixth option I just wanted to put on the table here quickly is this idea that 8th grade students who are taking an advanced math class like geometry, the federal law actually says you states are allowed to give them a different assessment that's, in this case, a geometry assessment as opposed to the 8th grade assessment that all your other students are doing. However, if you're going to do that, you are going to need to articulate in your plan that gets submitted next year what exactly is your strategy for giving all kids the opportunity to be able to take advanced middle school math classes. So I think what the federal law is trying to say and what the regulations are saying is, by all means, create kind of a separate test for your more advanced students, but you got to tell us how what your strategies are in the state for trying to get more kids into those advanced courses as opposed to having those be sort of elite separate courses that only a few kids really have access to in the end. I'm going to turn things over here to Heidi in just a second. I noticed that somebody in the chat asked about federal rules authorizing parents to withdraw their students from testing. And this is one of, I think, these tricky issues that, you know, ESSA, again, tried to thread the needle, maybe not quite so successfully. So, yes, states are allowed under ESSA to pass laws that allow parents to opt out their students from testing. However, the law is also still very clear that states need to assure that 95% of the students in school districts are taking these assessments. And it actually requires that states report out, in some ways, take into account that if not all kids are taking the test, that gets kind of factored into accountability ratings and decisions in some way. So, yes, states could choose to give parents more explicitly the right to do that, but in doing so, states really need to lean into the challenge of really making the case for parents about why it's still really important for their kids to participate, and to also factor into their accountability system how you're going to report out that the data you're getting actually isn't great data because not everybody's participating. So, you know, throughout the last half hour here as I've been talking, lots of questions I think kept popping up around. As you think about next steps, you've got to ask questions about, at the end, what are we really valuing? What is it we need to know? What is it we want to measure? How do we want to measure it? What sort of data will our different stakeholders, what policymakers want is very different from what teachers are going to need and want. What data is most useful, and how do we kind of tackle some of these issues of consistency as we think about innovating or trying something different? These are all really important questions to think through. I think the first thing I wanted to say here is that all of you as policymakers and especially legislators really need to lean in and become really good consumers. I think you need to be asking these questions. You need to drive these conversations in your state. You need to really interrogate and make sure, why are we doing this, and how does this align with where we're going as a state, and why is this option better than another option? And then secondly is, and I think you all talked about this for those of you who are on the prior call that on ESSA that NCSL and the Hunt Institute sponsored, the law also has a pretty high standard for engaging your stakeholders and answering questions like these. And so I want to turn things over to Heidi Guarino now, my colleague, to just talk a little bit about how you could think about some of the stakeholder engagement responsibilities or requirements in the law and how those might apply to how you could start unpacking some of these assessment decisions.
Thanks, Bill. Before you sign off, I think you have one last question here in the chat.
Oh, actually, let me take a look at that. Why don't you get started here, Heidi, and I can maybe chime in here at the end. Or I'll
okay. Okay. Thanks a lot, Bill, and nice to talk with all of you. So Bill and Lucille asked me to join today to take the conversation back up to about the 30,000-foot level. I think Bill gave a good overview deep in the weeds on the details of the assessment flexibility, but I want to take us back up to think more broadly about stakeholder engagement. I think what's really important around engagement first is just to understand that there are some ways to engage with your stakeholders well, and there are some ways to engage with your stakeholders really poorly. And so I want to talk through some of what we've seen as kind of best practice that that really these are approaches that are relevant to assessment, but also relevant to virtually any topic under ESSA, or really any topic in which you need to engage with your stakeholders and really hear what the public has to say. But before we get started, what I want to do is just be clear on what we're talking about. So stakeholders, in this case, stakeholders are anyone with a stake in public education. So that's your teachers, that's your administrators, it's your parents, it's your community, it's your business leaders, anyone who really cares what happens in your school. It's also your legislators. It's the people who are policymakers. It's anyone who's paying attention, really anyone who pays taxes in your community. And engagement is so much more than what we typically think of it as being. Engagement is not just pushing information out the door to inform people. It's really about listening and creating opportunities for people to ask questions and creating opportunities for people to be involved in decision making and to really inform the process. So what I'm going to talk about today is all of that. I think some of this may be some information that you've heard in the past. I know Melissa McGrath participated in one of your past webinars from CCSSO, but we thought it was important to take a couple of minutes here just to go over some of this information again, because it's really important in this case in particular around the assessment flexibility to make sure that you're asking the right questions and giving the right people the opportunity to be heard. So to start off, I want to just take a minute to think about sort of how do we typically think about engagement and what is a new way to think about it. So if you sort of categorize it as the old way and the new way. So the old way that SEAs typically are known to engage with their stakeholders is just to field questions, to bring people together and take questions from the audience. The new way is to have a two-way conversation, to really have a dialogue and make sure that the people who are asking the questions are also having an opportunity to respond to your answers. There's, reaching out after you've already made up your mind on a decision so that you can check the box. But then there's also really the way that is preferred is really much more authentic, meaningful engagement well before decisions are made at a time when stakeholders can help to inform the decision making. There's bringing people together, talking to them, talking at them, and then never following up. Or there's clear follow-up. So bringing people together and then making sure that you check in with them later, send a summary of the conversation, making sure that stakeholders know that they were heard and how their input ultimately was used. And lastly, there's letting others define the message. So sort of stepping back, putting your head in the sand, and just letting the media or your opponents define exactly what's happening, or it's owning the message yourself. That's really the way that we'd like to see SEAs take control of the ESSA the plan development that's happening right now. Really own the message. Be proactive in your communication, be proactive in your outreach, and make sure that people hear from you where your plan is going. So this work is really critical work. So on this slide, actually, I'm just going to open the whole thing up and give you a second to take a look at it. I'm not going to read this to you, but I think it's important to frame stakeholder engagement in this way, just to raise a couple of particular issues. It's really important for states to change their approach to engagement to allow stakeholders to have really meaningful input, and to then use that input to inform the development of their plans, and create opportunities for stakeholders to have their questions answered, to keep them engaged, and to make sure that they're involved. If states are able to do this, if states take the time to do this and develop really aggressive plans, as a result of that, the plan that states will ultimately develop will be really bolstered, and it's going to be much stronger because it's going to represent the best thinking of your stakeholders. Oops. So in other words, I think we've all attended meetings like these. The new way of thinking about stakeholder engagement is not to put a microphone at the front of a room and let people line up behind it. That's a good way to make sure that the conversation gets way off topic and really isn't productive at all. So what we'd like to encourage states to do instead is to really work with their stakeholders to have a conversation. And so I want to take a couple of minutes now and walk you through these 10 steps. So Bill mentioned earlier this year, and I saw Lucille put the link up. Earlier this year, we worked with CCSSO to develop a pretty comprehensive stakeholder engagement guide that was built around these 10 elements. So these are not rocket science, but these are really basic core tenets that we strongly believe result in really effective, solid, meaningful engagement. So I'm just going to take a minute and walk through what we mean by each of these. Number one is clarify your goals. So Bill spoke to this earlier about being really clear on your vision around assessment. That's true with whatever your focus is. Just be very clear on where you're headed, what your vision is, and communicate about that. The second is to work with your partner organizations to identify and engage with your stakeholders. So this is about making sure that you're not in this by yourself. The SCA doesn't need to, at the state level, you don't need to feel like you have to go it alone. Find the like-minded partner organizations out there and work with them. Some stakeholders will be more likely to trust the partner organizations than they will to trust the SCA. So go out together. The third point here is speaking to your audience, and that too is very intentional. It's important that you are not speaking over your audience's head. You want to speak to your audience in a language that they can understand. You want to talk about topics that matter to them, ask questions that they can answer. You want to make sure that the content that you bring to your audiences, whether it's in writing, on the website, in an in-person meeting, in a survey, you want to make sure that you're doing that, that you're speaking to them and that you're able to engage with them in a way that they can contribute to. The fourth is about vehicles. So there are plenty of vehicles today, more so than a decade or more ago. There were maybe one or two ways to reach people, but now there are tons of ways to reach people between website or online forums or webinars or social media or in-person meetings or et cetera, et cetera. There's an array of different ways to reach people, and I think it's important today to use all of the vehicles that you have at your disposal. Try to take some time to figure out what's the best way to reach the stakeholders you need to reach, and then really focus on those vehicles, but don't just use one avenue. The fifth point here is about ambassadors, identifying your best ambassadors. So that goes back to number 2, is working with your partner organizations. So there are people out there who are on your side, and you need to figure out who those people are and work closely with them, and make sure that you're all speaking the same language, and that you're all on the same page, and then have them go out and speak for you. Have them go out and talk with teachers, talk with parents, and bring back the input that they're hearing. But your ambassadors can be your best friends as you're developing your plan. Number 6 gets at the point I made earlier about asking for input before decisions are made. This is something that SEAs, unfortunately, can be known for, is engaging people long after they've already decided what they're going to do, so that they can say that they engaged people. It's important that people feel like not only are they being heard, but that their input is being used, and that it's being asked for at a time when it matters. So keep that in mind. I've heard from lots of teachers that they're tired of being brought together long after they know that their input doesn't make a difference. Number 7 is about materials. You really need to keep your materials simple and brief. There's no need for it. Again, this gets back at speaking to your audience. You need to know what your audience is able to digest and what they want to see. You don't need to give everybody everything. You need to give people the content that they need. Give people the content that's most relevant for them. Number 8 is on the frequency of your communication. You need to communicate early. Again, this gets to owning your message, and often. People need to be able to know that they can rely on you, the SEA, to be conveying information and to be keeping them up to date on what's happening, so that they get their information from you and not from the people who are skewing the information the wrong way. Number 9 is on keeping your own team informed. So this is about working with your team inside your SEA, making sure that the people who work in your agency know what's happening and understand exactly where the state plan is going. And then lastly, turning these new connections into long-term relationships. Of these 10 points around stakeholder engagement, I would say that this is probably the most important one. If states are truly going to change the culture and change the way they're seen, it's going to be very important that the outreach that they do now around the development of their ESSA plans is not seen as just a sort of one-and-done outreach effort. It's important that as you reach out, as you build relationships with these new stakeholders, that you continue to come back to them and that you really allow those relationships to grow. So my last slide here, I'm just going to take a quick minute on this. This is, I spoke to this at the very beginning. Again, just as a reminder, engagement really does need to be about much more than just pushing information out to stakeholders. This is a graphic that the Reform Support Network developed a few years ago, and I think it's very helpful just in thinking about the purpose behind engagement and communications. And, you know, at the bottom you can see inform, and there is absolutely a place for just informing people, but you also need to make sure that your plan includes opportunities for inquiry, opportunities for people to be involved, and ultimately opportunities for the people who are really inspired by your work to support it and really play a role in helping to shape the state's plan.
Thank you, Heidi, and thanks, Bill. Now we're going to turn to Representative Robert Benning, who has served in the Indiana House of Representatives since 1992. Throughout his tenure, Representative Benning has been an advocate for education reform, and he currently serves as chair of the Indiana House Education Committee. He's going to talk about the way his state engaged stakeholders and how they've engaged them in decisions around assessment. So I'll turn it over now to Representative Benning.
Thank you, and good afternoon. In Indiana, we have had, even before No Child Left Behind, we had fairly rigorous accountability standards and had already created a statewide assessment system called ISTEP. And over time, we've had a series that's been transformed, and within the last several years, we've had our vendor was CTB McGraw-Hill for the total time that we have been administering ISTEP. But for the last several years, we've had several significant technical problems. And 2 years ago, we had to have an interim study committee to just look at validity because we had so many kids getting kicked off. They were not getting the full assessment. And so we had to study all summer looking at trying to turn our consultants in. We've continued to have problems. There's been significant problems with implementation. So when ESSA passed last fall, we began to think about what are our options. We knew that we would have to go about things a little bit differently than we have in the past. So this past session, we had a bill. I had a bill that actually did create a panel to look at what next generation assessment looks like. The panel, as I had originally drafted the bill, would have just looked at assessment and how we would move forward. However, because of all the controversy, we had to decouple accountability totally this year. We had emergency bills that decoupled it from the state accountability system as well as from teacher evaluation because of the implementation problems we had. So the fervor in the legislature was ISTEP has become like an ESSA. It needs to be eliminated or repealed. So our statute, or our state standardized test and our accountability system was basically established, was repealed. An amendment was made to this bill and has actually been repealed at this point. So we have one more year. We now have Pearson as our vendor. Pearson provides an assessment this spring with much less diversity. We have another year contract, but this new panel was created and has been meeting all summer long. We did try to have a cross-section of stakeholders involved. I'm not always sure that it's as big as it should be or as inclusive in some respects. On the panel, we have a member from the State Board of Education, a member representing higher ed, happens to be our commissioner for higher ed, superintendent of public instruction, the governor's office is represented. The chair of both the House and Senate Education Committee are included, workforce, and a commissioner for workforce development. And then the balance of the people are appointed by our educators, either superintendents, principals, or teachers, and they are appointed by four different appointing bodies. The superintendent of public instruction appoints for, the speaker appointed for, the pro tem appointed for, and the governor appointed for, plus the chair. So it's predominantly educators. And we have, as we began study, it has been an interesting process. We've used a lot of national consultants. NCSL came in and spoke initially about ESSA and some of the flexibility that are available out today. We've had a number of groups come out. We have Ed Weber, who's a consultant for the state board, who works for, I think, Michigan as well. Derek Briggs. There's just been a number of people that it's interesting as the dialogue that has occurred today on the webinar. You know, for instance, in secondary, I went into this thinking that it makes sense maybe to use the SAT or a college board state, but to use SAT or ACT as our high school assessment. Because I think, and this kind of has a little bit of bias from my time spent International Study Committee, where we have talked about assessment, how the rest of the world doesn't do as much as we do, and how those assessments that kids take in the rest of the world have more consequences for kids, and how our state and federal mandated assessment programs today have more consequences on schools and teachers, but really limited on students. So SAT made some sense because SAT has consequences in terms of where kids could go, what kind of access they would have. It was interesting, though, the principal and the gentleman who represents the Principal Association was appointed as he was a principal, and in representing them, said that the principals recently in a meeting they had unanimously were in favor of going back to end-of-course assessments, which we have moved away from. This iteration of ISTEP moved to ISTEP 10 as opposed to end-of-course assessments. And I think part of the concern was that SAT has much broader implications in terms of what you're assessing, and the little bit more narrow focus of having an end-of-course assessment focused just on your math, algebra 1 standards, and language arts was a little bit easier for them to get their arms around. However, I do think that as we move forward, there's a likelihood that if we go back to ECAs, we may also provide at no cost to the schools state-administered SAT opportunities, so kids, regardless of income levels, would have access to take SAT and maybe realize that they have the opportunity to be successful in a higher ed world that they didn't think of before. We have spent a lot of time, too, and I'm constantly being reminded, a number of my colleagues, everybody seems to want to drive to the simplest and the easiest goal rather than thinking broad picture. And, you know, you've got an opportunity today to really think out of the box, and as has been Bill and I have both talked about, is try to think long-term and think strategically, what do you want this to do? And unfortunately, so many people want it quick and easy and just want to get it pushed aside. So they tend to gravitate back to what they know about. And in the world of, when you're working in the K-12 world, one of the things that Ed Raber said early on in our process is that, unfortunately, a lot of educators today, and this is not something that's taught in our teacher prep programs, really don't have a lot of assessment literacy. They really don't know what is out there. In fact, this past meeting, after we'd had, I want to say 6 or 8 meetings, 2 of the educators asked what, and it was close to the end of the meeting, what are ECAs? And these are the very people that are going to be recommending the General Assembly what our next assessment looks like. So they tend to want to go to, like I said, the easiest and something that they think is going to work. And interim assessments have been something, as Bill had talked about, it's something that, like it was item number 8 in his list, is something that everybody thinks that's going to be the interim or the formative would be the best way to move forward. The problem with that we've tried to tell a number of people is, as Bill said, you're going to limit a lot of local options. You're going to have sequencing that would have to be done at the state level, so you have a number, every school basically at the same level, and in states where you have a lot of local control issues, that becomes a problem. So we continue to try to struggle through how do we move forward, and we're trying to look at, you know, what is out there. And this next meeting we have a chief coming out, Michael Cohen, going to share. We have our tactical attack committee is going to share, talk a little bit about alignment and how that it does require state alignment. We are also not a core state, so taking something off the shelf might work, but our standards are somewhat different, so you're going to have to do things a little bit differently. And I guess my frustration has been is that, you know, I look at New Hampshire and think, well, that looks like a great model for us to maybe aspire to move towards, but so many of the people just want to move to this quick and dirty formative test or interim test and walk away and say we're done. So my suggestion to policymakers, state board, whatever, is that this is a very deliberative process. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of education to get people to the point where they have some knowledge about it. And Bill and Heidi both kind of hit the point as well, is that a lot of people, especially policymakers and legislators, don't want to get into the weeds, and they just want an easy thing to be able to move forward with. But the reality is, if you really want to do what's right, and regardless of what your decision is, you're probably going to have to live with it for a while. So why not think out of the box and try to be as open-minded about what's out there and how you might be able to put this together, rather than limit yourself to just the world that we know today. And I think Bill said there's a lot of, or at least in one of the comments I asked him a question, there's not a lot of tests out there that are totally out of the box, but most states have only experience with the assessments that they've used. They don't have experience when our consortiums take. They don't have experience with what other states are doing. And so I think it's worthy of taking the time to really drive down deeply and make sure that you're inquiring and finding out what the best practices are. I know that NCSL has provided us a number of opportunities. We had, I think ETS had actually come out, Nancy Dory, I think it was, presented to us in Colorado, I believe it was, when we were in Denver, talked about the comparison between Smarter Balance, PARC, and MCAS. And, Massachusetts has been recognized as having one of the best state assessments, and MCAS now is using components from Smarter Balance to enhance their assessment, and now that both PARC and Smarter Balance are making consortium test questions available, it does create more flexibility for states to either enhance or try to do a collaborative effort with to put together things that would work for each and every state. So finally, like I said, I just can't reiterate enough that it takes time. It's a very deliberative process, and don't rush it, and don't try to do what's easy, but try to do what's right and think long-term about how you're going to apply it.
Thank you, Representative Benning. That's a great note for us to close on. We, unfortunately, are a little bit past our time, so I want to thank you again for sharing your experience in Indiana, as well as providing your insights into how difficult this is to do this work well and to do it right for your students. Just as a final note, today's webinar will be available on NCSL's archive site. And I want to thank our speakers once again, Bill, Heidi, Representative Benning, and all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you again.